The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he came in. And he's going to help make America healthy again. And now he's a great guy, and he really means it. He wants to do some things, and we're going to let him go to it. I just said, but, Bobby, leave the oil to me.
Big pharma giants are facing an uncertain future in their biggest market. President-elect Donald Trump has selected vaccine skeptic Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to run the country's healthcare department, which could lead to dramatic changes in the way drugs are priced in the US, as well as how much the country spends on creating new vaccinations for infectious diseases like Mpox. Trump may argue that RFK will help cut the US's spending on healthcare, which is projected to balloon to nearly $5 trillion this year. But the prospect of lower prices in the world's largest drug market could create systemic problems for the pharmaceutical industry. How companies like Pfizer, Novartis, and Roche can navigate a less friendly environment is the focus of this week's Viewsroom. Welcome back to the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast from Reuters Breakingviews that invites you, the listener, into a lively debate about the biggest stories of the week. I'm your host, Jonathan Guilford.
And I'm Amy Donlan.
So, Amy, RFK Jr. is, how do I put this lightly, not a conventional choice to head up a developed economy health system. Obviously, this is part of, let's say, a questionable discourse that has been going on for a while about whether vaccines are tied to autism, but also brings in more prosaic issues about pricing. I mean, how do you think about it? Is it possible to even get your arms around this yet? Or is it just like, oh my goodness, everybody's trying to deal with how out of the usual this pick is?
Oh, this is it. I mean, I think for every department, I think people are concerned, trying to see what will happen, think things through, scenarios. And I think health is one of the more interesting ones because, as you said, RFK has got some questionable views about vaccines. He has, talked about them being linked to autism, which has been completely debunked by the scientific community. And when I meet with the big pharma companies, certainly in Europe, their concern is that somebody would be running such an important department that doesn't believe in the science behind the decisions that they make. And then what happens with that? And then added to that is RFK did an interview in September with the Wall Street Journal where he talked about drug pricing specifically. Now, bear in mind, Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act has already brought in price caps and is going to bring in price caps on certain drugs. He's going a step further and talking about European drug prices, which would be some of the lowest in the world because of the way they're negotiated, and said, why is the US paying such high drug prices when look at what they're paying over in Europe? And as I said, this could cause big issues for drug makers. They often say that they make a lot of money in the US off high drug prices, and then they use that money to reinvest into research and development. And that's how you get these breakthroughs in drugs. This model is quite important to them.
Right. And I mean, obviously, Amy, you've been globetrotting a lot recently, kind of taking the temperature. But we do, in fact, have a transatlantic pharma dream team here. We're joined by Robert Siren, the US columnist covering pharma over here. Rob, how are you doing?
Good. How are you doing, Jonathan?
Doing just fine, thanks. I mean, as Amy said, we have a pretty big sea change here. And I think if you look at pharma stocks since the election, there's already been a notable decline there. And especially since the unconventional choice of RFK Jr. to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. I mean, what do you think investors are specifically focused on here?
Well, two things. Uncertainty. If you think about it, pharma stocks are their entire values rested in patents they hold, right? And if there's uncertainty over how long the patent duration is or how much money they can charge, that's going to cause a problem. And there's also the uncertainty of, what can RFK do, given he said he's been against vaccines for years. He's against water fluoridation. He's for all these kooky things like, chelation of heavy metals and drinking raw milk and stuff like that. So for the pharma companies, there's the whole question of what on earth is going to happen. The biggest focus is the drug pricing negotiations under Medicare. Under that right now, it's and the industry doesn't, and investors don't understand whether it's the free market kind of laissez-faire effects of the Trump administration deregulate, which will help pharma in some ways, or it'll be the kind of RFK anti-vaccine, anti-science view, which will emerge triumphant. And so investors are all kind of stepping back and saying, oh, who knows what's going to happen? I mean, some of it could be good. For instance, under the drug negotiations right now, if you make a medicine using what's called small molecules, like traditional type medicines, you only have, I think it's 9 years. But if you have a biological drug, which is a drug being made with cells with cells, it gets a longer period of exclusivity before the government can negotiate a discount. And so the industry is hopeful that maybe they can lengthen the window in which the drug price can't get negotiated, which would be good for pharma industry. But then there's the whole fear of, what will happen to vaccines, like Moderna, for example. All the revenue right now comes from vaccines, and that's one reason why the stock's down 20% since Trump was elected.
Right. This is the thing. There's so much here. And like you say, it goes along so many different ideological lines and cross currents that have been running through, I think, U.S. health policy conversations for a while, right? RFK Jr. adds some unusual elements to that, to say the least, but not all of this is a new conversation. So I think maybe it helps to try and pick through kind of where we're seeing, say, outsized reactions and think about what that's telling us. And I mean, Amy, European drug makers like Novartis and Ozempic maker Novo Nordisk have experienced more acute declines in their stock prices. Is that telling us something about what we should expect?
Yeah, so I think that, as Rob said, there's a lot to sort of unpick, and I think investors are trying to figure out, whether specific pharma companies might do better. And I think what you're seeing with the European drug makers, so the very large ones are Novartis, Roche, Novo Nordisk, which you mentioned, which makes the obesity medication, Wegovy, as well as Ozempic, which people would know the brand better. Overall, their equity prices went down about 6% in the week after RFK was announced. And the US companies went down 2%. So what I think that could tell you is that there might be a bit of an America first angle to this as well. So would there be tariffs? There could be a possible trade war. And actually, surprisingly, a lot of the European drug makers import drugs into the US. So would they be slapped with tariffs? And that would obviously hit their bottom line pretty badly if they were slapped with those kinds of tariffs. So that, I think that's kind of that's the concern. And RFK did name check Ozempic as an example of a drug that he would like to see come down in price. He mentioned that in Germany, for example, Germans pay about 10% of the list price of what they pay in the US. So I think that's the jitters that investors have specifically about the Europeans.
Got it. And it's interesting because there's these two paths here on this sort of America First ideal, right? Which is you take it as read for a moment that there is something here to the thesis that outsized profits available in America or higher pricing available in America does help power the kind of global cycle of drug development, right? What does that mean for not only kind of mainstream drugs, stuff like Ozempic, stuff that maybe RFK does not have such eccentric views on, but also vaccines? If you're pulling back on kind of the scientific environment in that, for that two core kind of everything about vaccine development is pulling back in the US, that also potentially has a global implication. Is this sort of like what we see in our other areas like defense, where the idea is, okay, US first means less money into NATO, which means other NATO members have to step up with investment? Or is this just like a problem that the pharma industry cannot really solve elsewhere?
I think, Rob, that there is like an interesting point on this, that there could be some good that comes out of RFK and some of his strategies, because the truth is it's hard to argue why Americans pay the drug prices that they do. They are very hard to justify. And the fact is that just the way that the negotiating model works in Europe is that the Europe as a whole is negotiating on behalf of like 500 million consumers. And so therefore the drug prices are extremely aggressive, and every year, a drug maker that will come to Europe, they will say, we want this lower. How can we make this lower? The NHS in the UK is very similar. they will only buy drugs that they think are very efficacious and cheap. So the US obviously has a very different model to that, and the insurance model makes that very different. So I do think that there is that element to it. But to Rob's point, you might be incentivized as a pharmaceutical company then to focus on the drugs that you can make that will have longer patent life. That might be the way you get around this, is to try and make as much money as you can from the drugs that you invest in, which then obviously means that you don't necessarily spend as much time in the other versions of the drugs that have, shorter patents.
But so on things that are, say, a little more mission critical, like vaccines, does that mean we just lose some quantum of development?
Probably. If you think about it, the return on investment for pharma companies is actually pretty low on drug development. Studies that have looked at it have estimates of about like low single digit return on investment. So most of that is actually, not done well. There are big societal benefits from that, of course, having drugs that work. And so you've got kind of a market coordination problem where, it may be useful for society to invest a lot in medicine, but no one's doing it. And so if that happens, then there's less development. In the United States is a good example. I mean, for all the attention is focused on drug pricing, but drugs are about 15% of all healthcare spending, and they haven't seen nearly the rise that something like hospitals have. And that's because, hospital bills are a lot more. I broke my collarbone, it was a $15,000 bill I received. For a European, that's kind of crazy. But, the actual bill itself was like $240,000 or something, and the insurance company paid it. That's worth a lot of prescriptions of Ozempic, if you think about it that way. And so what happens is it attracts all this attention. And if the market, which provides about 45% of all spending in the world on pharma, if that amount is reduced, there'll probably just be fewer drugs developed.
I think as well, though, I think there's like an other interesting element of this as well, is if you do have a vaccine skeptic in charge of this department, I mean, you can't forget that we had a global pandemic very recently. The US was, I would say, more prepared than a lot of other countries just because of how much it spent on pandemic preparedness in the lead up to it. It wasn't enough, obviously, but it was more than I think a lot of other countries spent. And even this Mpox outbreak that happened in Africa, a very infectious disease, it was the US that funded a lot of that vaccine development. They gave money to a company called Bavarian Nordic who created the vaccine. And they do tend to be almost like looking around the globe for things that could get out of control and are funding vaccines for that. And if you don't have America doing that, I think your kind of NATO question, Jonathan, is interesting, is that if America is no longer subsidizing that, does Europe need to step in? Does China need to step in? Do other countries then need to start looking at ways in which they can fund that sort of prevention so you don't end up with an outbreak, that you don't end up with an Mpox that goes global?
Well, I mean, to put that a little more bluntly, are you saying that there's a possibility that European drug makers in general can maybe hedge against a less friendly White House by pivoting to China, to India? Like, are there meaningful end markets there?
So I would say no to those markets. I would say China, I would not be recommending any pharmaceutical company pivot to that area, just because at the moment it's not particularly friendly to the pharmaceutical companies. And ask AstraZeneca about that. I mean, their president of China was detained recently. They had done very, very well in China, had rapidly expanded there. And that has really there's a big question mark over that company now and what happens with that business. So I would actually think that, ironically, somewhat bizarrely, the solution to the Europeans' problems might lie in the cause. So going to the US, expanding more into the US, expanding manufacturing in the US might be a hedge against this. And we've already seen a little bit of that. Novo Nordisk, for example, bought a big drug manufacturer in the US earlier this year. They spent a lot of money on it. But now they have manufacturing there. They're not importing those drugs. They're making them in the US and selling them in the US. So that kind of removes the import threat or the tariffs on that. And the other thing they can do is deals. So they can, Novartis is a good example. They're number one in Europe. So they can't really expand much further in there. So I think that it would be an idea for them. They've got plenty of money to do a deal. And that, again, makes them look more American, which might be better from this government's perspective, given how much they are in favor of America first.
Got it. Rob, anything that you would throw in there? Does it seem like we're in a moment where M&A is actually feasible?
It's actually, I think it's probably more feasible than it was before. The outgoing administration, they challenged a lot of deals, even in pharma, which traditionally never attracted much regulatory attention just because there's so little competition among companies. Maybe they might have to divest one drug or something like that, but that was it. But then the Biden administration came out with all these novel theories. They didn't stand up in court. So the Trump administration will probably go back to traditional M&A, and it won't be a barrier for almost any pharma deal. So you could see more of that. And I agree with Amy that the producing drugs here would be a huge thing. These are incredibly high margin things, products. All the expenses in making them, once you make them, if you can sell additional things, they're highly profitable. And so make them here so they're out of the way of tariffs. And then also, you get a seat at the table. I mean, pharma has always been a large lobbyist in DC. I mean, that's one of the things that RFK actually is against. He doesn't like that. But money does talk in Washington. And I think, the more money that goes to a party, the more likely they are to oppose anything. Like, for instance, on the Medicare drug pricing, most Republicans were against it. That's because they tended to, they received money from the pharma industry, and they also are free market people. So, what caused their opposition, we don't know. But, the money certainly helped. And so I think that, it might be helpful for them as well.
Got it. So ultimately, RFK Jr. provides a booster shot to lobbyists and investment bankers. Okay. Well, on that note, Rob, Amy, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.
Jonathan. Thanks for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Tashlich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Viewsroom every Thursday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. And don't forget to tune in to our sister podcast, The Big View, every Tuesday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you like what you heard, please follow The Viewsroom and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.